You've written in the Financial Review today on the GST. You're a member, of course, of the Howard government 20 years ago this week that introduced the GST. Can you reflect on that and the challenges faced by the government at the time in achieving what was one of the major reforms of recent decades?
Well, remember that it was something like the fourth attempt that there had been to introduce what we could now call a GST, going back to almost to the Fraser years and the Hewson election, Keating's Option C and so on. So the public were well attuned to the arguments, and the public debate had focused substantially on the arguments for and against the GST. So it was a politically very divisive issue. The opposition, oppositions will be opportunistic, I suppose, by definition, and they opposed it. So it became politically quite problematic for the Howard government. But it was a reform that we thought was necessary, that the tax system was badly designed. It wasn't neutral. It was complicated. There were state taxes which were in and of themselves particularly regressive, not least the payroll tax, which is an anti-jobs tax. If we could sweep away a lot of those taxes and also reduce the burden of income tax with a very simple, straightforward GST across the board, then the economy would benefit. But as it turned out, of course, we had to make quite a lot of political compromises on the way through. So the GST was never quite as comprehensive as we'd hoped it would be.
Now, today you've written in the Financial Review suggesting that broadening the base is a good idea, but also would be a mighty political challenge. It would be no greater than what, of course, the Howard government faced in introducing it in the first place, though.
Well, I wouldn't have thought the present government would want to take on this challenge just like right now, because they've got to deal with the coronavirus crisis. But in the context of trying to revive the economy, assuming the coronavirus comes to an end one day, trying to revive the economy, that is an opportunity to make both tax and labour market reforms. They do have a mechanism which we didn't have. I suppose we could have created, but we didn't think to do so. And that is this national cabinet. You would have to get the states very much on side to make a reform of broadening the indirect tax base, the GST base, offsetting that with abolition of some state taxes, in particular payroll tax, and reducing income taxes and adjusting, perhaps increasing social security payments. You'd have to put forward a whole package. You would have to do that through the National Cabinet. You would have to have the support of the states, or most of the states. If you did that, well, then you'd have a good chance of getting public support for it. But it would be a mighty difficult task, but it would be a reform well worth making, because it would make the economy work better than it currently does with the hodgepodge of taxes that we still have.
And we need everything working in that direction, obviously, in the recovery out of this particular pandemic and the downturn associated with it. But you also wrote today that the process was as simple as it was rational. We considered what an ideal policy would be, then we contemplated the politics of how to manage it, not the other way around.
Yes, that's. I'd like to say that the present government does that. We saw with a number of governments between the Howard government and the present government, them focusing on the politics and then dreaming up a policy to address the politics, whereas best to concentrate on what an ideal policy would be, work with the Treasury on that, and then in turn start to work out how you manage the politics. So the ideal tax system would be to have a GST which was comprehensive, covered all goods and services, all aspects of consumption in the Australian economy, reduce personal income taxes, adjust social security payments, and abolish many of the state taxes. And the states, of course, would get the revenue from the GST, or most of it. Now, that's a rational model. Now, how would you implement that? Well, first of all, you have to crank up the public debate. Secondly, you'd have to get support through the National Cabinet process. And once you'd achieved that, you might have to go to an election. And then if you won the election, then implement the changes. But it would be a big task. It's a task for the medium term, not a very short-term task.
When you look at this situation, though, from your experience of watching the electorate, public opinion, and the political challenges that your government at the time faced, and your knowledge of Australian political history, is there a greater appetite at a time of crisis when people know that their businesses have been smashed, their kids are out of work and so on, they know something substantial has to be done? Is there a greater appetite for bold reform at times like this?
Yeah, absolutely. When the community is hurting, they're prepared to consider reform. When they're not, frankly, they're pretty reluctant to make change because, Australians are understandably, people say conservative. I think the right word isn't conservative. I think the right word is cautious people. So if you're going to make a big change, you've really got to prove that beyond reasonable doubt to them. Otherwise, they'll stick with the status quo. So just to take a historic perspective, in 1982, we had a global recession. The Fraser government wrestled with that. It spent a huge amount of money through into 1983. The government changed. The new government had inherited what had been an economic crisis. So in those circumstances, the Hawke government was able to make quite a lot of changes and have, broadly speaking, public support for them. The Howard government came in after the recession we had to have and the sort of tumult of the Keating years. And the public, I think, then thought, well, yes, maybe we do need some sort of reform to drive on the economy. But honestly, since the Hawke and Howard economic reforms, Australia has just been motoring along 29 years without a recession. And it's all very well to criticise the politicians, but it's pretty hard to persuade the public in those circumstances of low unemployment and steady economic growth to agree to substantial economic reform and disruption that brings. But now, of course, the public are not really hurting yet in the way they will do. I might be hurting, but they, in my view, will hurt a great deal more as this year wears on. And with that pain, they will start to cast around for somebody who has a solution to that pain. And that might be an opportunity to look at both labour market and tax reforms of the sort that we've been talking about.
So, and if we look at the raw politics of the equation now versus the Howard government and its challenge into 98, I guess there's a big difference in the buffer. There isn't the seat buffer. How would you reflect on that? Or do you think that's countered by the fact that any broadening isn't an entirely new proposition? It's actually, people know the lived experience of the GST now. It's not something completely that they can't relate to.
I'm not sure. If you told the public that we're going to slap the GST on health and education and financial services, one or two, fresh food, instinctively they would think that was a bad idea. After all, the previous parliament, before the last election, I think it was, decided to take the GST off sanitary ware, which was, a pretty strange decision, I thought, entirely politically driven and not rational. So you would have to start to broaden the base of the GST, which at the moment only covers around 50% of all consumption in Australia, compared to the New Zealand GST, which covers something like 96% of all consumption. You would have to start to build a case for it, and you'd have to work with the states to build that case. So the New South Wales government has started talking about this, but you'd have to get the Victorian and Western Australian and South Australian and Queensland, Tasmanian governments on side, or more or less on side. So I don't think it's something you could do quickly, but I think it's something that should be on the agenda. And you probably have to have an election. It would have to come after an election. You'd have to go to an election with a reform program.
Finally, before I let you go, I'm interested in your thoughts as we watch from afar the unfolding events in the United States, from the health to the law and order to the political equation of Trump v Biden. What's your sense of things 4 months out from the presidential election? Is it likely that Trump will triumph despite the crisis?
If you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said I thought that Trump was going to win the election, even though he was a bit behind in the polls. Put him onto a platform with Biden, and Biden is a very weak, spontaneous performer. So he's fine with the prepared texts to camera, but put him into a debate, and I think he would be very weak and Trump would be a known quantity. But the trouble for Trump is that he has had to confront a great crisis which was not of his making, the coronavirus crisis. And his commentary through that crisis, I think, has done him quite a lot of damage. And over and above that, well, he could have handled the Black Lives Matter controversy with a greater degree of tact. I'm not suggesting he should have just agreed to every proposition that the political left in America is putting forward, but he could have handled it with better language. And I think those things are doing him damage. So I think the odds are starting to favour Biden. If the Democrats had a strong candidate, I think they would sweep in easily. But Biden, I mean, he's not very young. He'll be 78 by the time the election comes. And sometimes I'm sorry to say, I hope this doesn't sound ageist, but I think it shows. And that won't help him.